All right, now, thank you so much for staying with us. So we're talking about climate action and energy transition, where the minister stated that Nigeria had established institutions diligently in implementing the energy transition plan. Minister Bagudu stated that the country has prioritized 5 sectors, including power, transport, cooking, oil and gas industry, which accounts for about 65% of Nigeria's total greenhouse gas emissions. He added that the universal energy access, poverty reduction, economic growth and job creation remain the nation's goals. Mr. Bagudu noted that Nigeria's energy transition plan is multifaceted, targeting emission reduction and enhancing sustainability across key sectors. Well, I won't be doing the talking, but my guest is Tengi Georgie Koli. She's a senior officer at Natural Resource Governance Institute. It's good to see you. It's been a while. How's work?
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it's been a while.
Thank you so much for coming in. So just like many other African countries, Nigeria is trying to navigate energy transition. What does a just and equitable energy transition look like? Now, let's look at Nigeria's context.
Okay. Thank you for that question. I think it's a very important perspective to look at. When we have this conversation, there's always a reflection that Africa has not contributed significantly to the climate action. Yeah. However, Africa will suffer most of the impacts from this transition. There are economic, environmental, and social impacts, and it's important to drive environmental justice, economic stability, and social inclusion. And that is how you're able to achieve a just energy transition, by putting people at the center, as opposed to looking at more capitalist perspectives. So if we're shifting from fossil fuels, which like oil, gas, and coal, to renewable energies like wind and solar, it's important to make sure that those that have suffered from exploitation of fossil fuels are considered in terms of the legacy pollutions that are left behind. And then those communities that have depended on fossil fuel revenues are also carried along, because they rely on jobs and their economies thrive based on those revenues. You have countries, you have states in Niger Delta, including Bayelsa, where I'm from, Delta, Akwa Ibom, all depending on fossil fuel revenues from over 50%. Yeah. And so if you were to stop fossil fuels, what would be the impact be on those economies and those communities and those families? So that's what we mean by just in transition. And making sure that you put the priorities of people first, meaning energy security, energy access, job opportunities, just making sure that as we're looking at transition, we're putting people first.
Now, as part of the energy strategy, the government has rolled out several initiatives. I said that even in my introduction, and expanding gas usage. Now, how do we ensure these efforts support the goal of energy transition, security without jeopardizing climate, and of course, energy transition action?
Another good question. Nigeria has determined to leverage gas as a transition fuel. And what that means is that we've determined that we're going to increase and enhance our use of gas across different sectors that you mentioned, right? So for power, we want to use gas. For transportation, we want to use CNG. For clean cooking, we want to use LPG. And those have potential impacts on the communities, on how we actually achieve our climate goals. Because we still have a target to achieve net zero by 2060. So how do we balance those efforts? It's about having clear timelines, clear goals, and being able to track our progress and recalibrate as we move forward. It's about making sure that we as a people have the right institutions that have been mandated actually coordinate these efforts, making sure that all the different institutions, from the Ministry of Environment to the Ministry of Petroleum Resources, all have clear understanding of their own roles and put in place the right things so that we can get these goals that we have in place, but making sure that, for instance, policies like the Energy Transition Plan, Decade of Gas policies, are all complementary. We have goals to transition from gas, but we have goals to also upscale renewables. What is the balance going to look like as we're shifting our focus for economy, as we're driving economic diversification away from fossil fuels? What does that look like? What can states do? What is Nigeria actually doing practically? Same thing for our energy shift as well. What role will renewables play over time? What role will gas play? And what are the different responsibilities that are going to fit into that?
And one test whether Nigeria's energy transition efforts and commitment to net zero is serious is how we deal with harmful byproducts of fossil fuel use, like methane. Now, my question to you really will be, how does methane reduction fit into the bigger picture of this Nigeria's energy transition?
In your intro, you mentioned that Nigeria has targeted the energy sector.
Yeah.
And is focusing on reducing 65%. Well, that's the sector that contributes 65%. So how does it reduce or tackle that sector? Methane emissions is quite significant because it is a byproduct of this ambition to scale up gas. It has a potency of 80 times more than carbon over a 20-year period. So it's important that Nigeria actually targets that if it wants to get the right results of reducing methane emissions in general. But there are positives when looking at this methane. It also fits into Nigeria's economic goals because if we reduce our methane, it gives us access to markets where there are now more stringent regulations that limit the possibility of high-emitting products like fossil fuels to come into those countries. It also reduces wasted gas, and gas flaring potentially as well, which has benefits for the health and the environment of those communities that are currently suffering from the harmful effects around cardiovascular issues, respiratory issues, and impacts on their economy from acid rain falling on the land and also in the rivers, affecting fishery and farming. So there are positive benefits in this, as well as it's cost effective to also adopt methane emission strategies because it pays for itself. If you abate your methane, you then have gas and you can sell and you can also earn revenues from that as well.
Interesting stuff. Now, well, methane is a potent greenhouse gas and Nigeria has signed into the global methane pledge. Now, what practical steps would you say has government taken so far and where are the biggest gaps in this implementation?
I'll start by commending the Nigerian government because on the continent, we've made the most progress in terms of our laws and our policies.
Great stuff.
However, there's always a however.
Oh, of course, always.
And I think the last speaker also mentioned challenges around implementation and enforcement, right? So we signed up to Paris Agreement. We have our NDCs, so nationally determined contributions, where Nigeria has determined that it will reduce the components of methane. So you have fugitives, you have venting, and you have gas flaring. You have commitments to reduce fugitives by 60% by 2031. You have plans to eliminate gas flaring by 2030, but nothing actually certain for venting. And venting is actually the most significant. So it will be important to also set targets in our new NDCs that we're working on. And also making sure that we have, again, National Council on Climate Change is doing a lot. They were put in place by the Climate Change Act in 2021. However, there's a bit more coordination that is required in that space. To the combination that I mentioned earlier on, the upstream regulator, the NUPRC, has put in place guidelines in 2023 to try to curb methane emissions. But we need similar sort of guidelines within the midstream and the downstream sectors. So something needs to be done in that regard. You also have a need to track progress, right? We're saying that we have targets to eliminate gas flaring, fugitives, attain net zero by 2060, but we don't have a means to really track progress. So we need the NCCC, National Council on Climate Change, to put in place a baseline for us to be able to track how far or how well are we doing. Gas flaring targets are not new in Nigeria, but we're constantly unable to meet them, constantly pushing the goalposts. But this is because we don't put in place baselines and opportunities to be able to track that progress. And then data is very important in terms of understanding what companies are doing, how well are they doing, how well are they not. That can allow civil society communities who experience these issues to actually be integrated into that process to ensure that Nigeria is doing what it's doing, call out the companies as well, where that is needed, to make sure that Nigeria is able to meet its goals, but as I said, putting people first, which is what characterizes a just energy transition.
Because you just took me that my next question, honestly, because I was looking at data and enforcement, which remains a challenge. It's a major one. Now, what can government do now to strengthen methane monitoring, improve transparency, and ensure all companies are accountable? That's always the big question.
It is the biggest question, and there have been challenges over time. Innovations need to be adopted in this sort of area. I will say also that methane is a progressing sort of area. It's a newish area, and we're constantly learning from it. And so I would advise R&D by the government to put in place so that we can learn what technologies can also be specific to the Nigerian context, right? There's satellites that can also be used for gas flaring. NOSDRA has a gas flare tracker, and I understand they're trying to update that to a methane tracker. There are global tools, methane sats and other different tools that we can use. Mars, there are organizations that have tools that governments can actually use as well, so COMATs. There are so many things out there that we can use to track progress. And then there are even handhelds. I'm always reminded of that by the regulators, that they also use to track and monitor. But it has to be more consistent, and it has to be more at a real-time sort of phase. Right now, it's a bit more of a lengthy period between monitoring and remediation. And then I think those are really important things. We also have the Nigerian Extractive Industry and Transparency Initiative.
NATI, right?
NATI, yes, that have done something that I think is quite remarkable. They have created or incorporated in their audit process a requirement where companies have to share their greenhouse gas emissions data and their methane data. In 2022 and 2023, you had 15 companies disclose, but 47 have not, which is quite a gap. And then I also understand that the regulators have some data, but they're not publicly disclosing it, even though they're required to do so by law. The more data we have, the more we can track progress and really understand where we're all going. And I think that's an important gap that needs to be filled in this process.
Now, if Nigeria is serious about climate goals and, of course, protecting communities, what really do you think are the immediate action policymakers should take, of course, to help court methane and signal energy transition progress?
I mentioned initially that we've not had the kind of progress that we want to see over time.
Yes.
You've had World Bank, gas flaring initiatives. You've had Nigeria's initiatives over time as well, but we haven't met it. So I want to propose something a bit more strict, a bit more stronger.
Please do. We
have to enforce a zero routine flaring mandate without any exceptions. If we want to take this very seriously, we have to put in place incentives also for companies, right, where you can give them a little bit of a carrot, something to encourage them to continue.
Yeah, I do that.
Like tax breaks if they're able to comply, adopting the right sort of technologies in place, and consequently, those that do not, then putting in place very strict penalties for non-compliance, potentially revoking licenses. Like I said, this is a harsh, trying to make sure that we actually achieve the goals that we've set. And those sort of indications will demonstrate to the international community that Nigeria is serious and ready to put its money where its mouth is, to make sure that we're able to achieve the goals that we have set. And that we are not, at this time, willing to continue moving the goalpost. We are serious, and we want to make sure as well that communities, that we're mindful of the kind of impact that communities have. We want to make sure that their environments, and their health are preserved in a way that can ensure that Nigeria moves forward appropriately. We're working with communities and civil society organizations and media to let them know what already exists, but the progress that needs to be made, right? So next week we'll be engaging with all these different actors, and we also encourage the government as well to work with us in this phase. It's not necessarily to say that the government is not doing good things. They are, but it takes a collective effort. You and I, communities, civil society, the government, those in the parliament also have a very strong role to play in this.
And media relations like this too, because you need to tell the world what is happening.
Yes,
What's your outlook, briefly, as we wrap this up, for the entire transition thing and Nigeria's role? What's your outlook? How well do you see all of it playing out? Let's say maybe towards the end of 2025?
We're making some progress, but we have a lot more to accomplish.
A lot of work to be done. Yes,
we have Decade of Gas, which started from 2010 to 2030. We're at the midpoint, actually. So we need to hold the government account. What are we really doing? And are we any closer? We need to see progress. We actually don't know. How far are we to our targets, and how far do we need to go? So these are important, I think, questions that we need to ask. Government is making progress, but a lot more needs to be done.
Thank you, Georgie Coley. It's really good to see you in Abuja. Thank you so much for being on the program. Senior Officer with Natural Resource Governance Institute.
Thank you.
Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, let's take another break. And when we come back, we should be looking at market figures. Mr. David Adori, Vice Chairman of HiCap Securities, is my guest.